Founder Suge Knight had a lot to say about the Tupac Shakur murder trial during a jailhouse interview with TMZ. Knight was in the car with Tupac the night he was shot on the Strip in September of 1996.
A man serving a 28-year prison sentence in California picked up a phone this month and said something that rippled all the way to a Las Vegas courtroom. He wasn't confessing to anything. He was warning people to leave him out of it entirely. And the way he said it made it sound less like a request and more like a threat aimed at anyone who might try to force him onto a witness stand. That man is Marion Suge Knight, the former head of Death Row Records, now 61 years old and locked up at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility outside San Diego. He's there for running over and killing a man in a Compton parking lot in 2015, and he won't be eligible for release until he's well past 70. He has nothing to gain from talking to anyone, and he knows it. Yet in the days before jury selection began for the only criminal trial ever brought in connection with Tupac Shakur's 1996 murder, Knight sat for an interview with ABC News and made it unmistakably clear that if prosecutors tried to compel his testimony, there would be consequences for whoever put him in that position. It wasn't the language of a man preparing to cooperate. It was the language of someone who has spent 30 years treating silence as a form of power and who isn't interested in giving that power up now, no matter who's on trial. The man who is on trial is Dwayne "Kef" D. Davis, a former shot caller for the Southside Compton Crips, now 63 years old. He's accused of orchestrating the drive-by shooting that killed Shakur on the Las Vegas Strip on September 7, 1996, a killing that has haunted hip-hop and law enforcement alike for 3 decades without a single person ever being charged, until Davis. According to court reporting out of Las Vegas this month, a jury of 12 jurors and 4 alternates, was seated after about a week of questioning, and opening statements got underway in mid-August. Roughly 40 witnesses are expected to take the stand over what's projected to be a month-long trial, and Suge Knight's name is on that witness list, whether he wants it there or not. To understand why Knight's silence matters so much, you have to go back to what he actually witnessed. He was behind the wheel of the BMW that night. He was sitting less than 2 feet from Shakur when gunfire tore through the passenger side of the car. He watched his friend get hit multiple times, made a turn on blown tires, and drove toward the hospital with a dying man beside him. For 30 years, through police questioning, a grand jury process, documentaries, and now an actual murder trial, he has never identified a shooter. It isn't a memory problem. Knight has said, in effect, that testifying against someone is a betrayal worse than violence itself, that a bullet ends a man's life once, but naming him in open court destroys him over and over. Whether you find that code admirable or monstrous, it explains why prosecutors can subpoena him and still walk away with nothing useful. The night itself has become one of the most picked-over timelines in modern criminal history, but a few of the smaller details still don't get enough attention. Las Vegas that weekend was overflowing with people who'd flown in for Mike Tyson's fight against Bruce Seldon at the MGM Grand. Shakur and Knight had ringside seats. Tyson won in the first round, and as the crowd spilled into the MGM lobby afterward, a Death Row associate spotted Orlando "Baby" Lane Anderson, a young Southside Crip who, months earlier, had been part of a group that jumped a Death Row associate at a mall and stripped him of a gold chain bearing the label's medallion. In that world, taking someone's chain wasn't simple theft. It was a calculated insult, a way of humiliating one of the most feared organizations in the music industry. When Shakur was pointed toward Anderson in that lobby, he didn't hesitate. He crossed the room and threw the first punch, and Knight and several others joined in. Security cameras caught the entire beating, and that footage would end up playing on national news for weeks. What gets lost in the retelling is what was going on in Shakur's head afterward. According to Knight's later account, Shakur was less worried about Anderson than he was about his own legal situation. He'd only been out of custody since Knight posted his bail the year before, while he appealed a conviction he always denied, and getting caught on camera assaulting someone could have sent him straight back to prison. He reportedly told people that night that he'd die before he let that happen. He changed out of his fight night clothes at the Luxor, climbed into Knight's BMW, and the two of them set out for a club Knight owned, trailed by a convoy of other Death Row vehicles. Fans were chasing the car. Shakur was hanging out of the sunroof. And then, at a red light where East Flamingo Road meets Koval Lane, a white Cadillac pulled up beside them, and within seconds the gunfire started that would end Shakur's life 6 days later. For more than 2 decades afterward, this looked like a case that would never close. There was no motor weapon recovered, no Cadillac ever found, and the man widely suspected of pulling the trigger, Orlando Anderson, was killed in an unrelated Compton shooting less than 2 years after Shakur died. What eventually cracked the case wasn't new forensic evidence. It was Kefty Davis's own inability to stop talking about it. Over roughly 20 years, Davis gave interviews to multiple television networks, appeared in a docuseries where he described the shots coming from the back seat of the Cadillac, and in 2019 published a memoir promoted with the tagline that its author was the last living eyewitness to Shakur's killing. In that book, he described how he obtained the gun used in the shooting, described riding in the Cadillac, and even detailed what he was wearing that night, a detail investigators later matched to an old photograph. Prosecutors arrested him at his home outside Las Vegas in 2023, ending what had, by his own account, been a quiet retirement spent playing golf with his grandchildren. Davis has pleaded not guilty, and his legal team has tried to build a defense around the idea that he wasn't even in Las Vegas that night, an argument complicated by hotel records reportedly showing rooms booked under his wife's name and under Anderson's name at 2 different casinos on the night of the shooting. But the piece of evidence that may do the most damage to his case isn't a hotel receipt at all. It's a recorded jailhouse phone call he made to a woman identified as his mistress just days after his arrest. Every inmate is told, repeatedly, that these calls are recorded, and Davis made his anyway. When the woman asked him about the memoir, he didn't hesitate. He confirmed, in a handful of words, that he had written it, directly contradicting the defense he and his lawyers had spent months constructing, which claimed the book was essentially fiction ghostwritten by his co-author and that Davis himself had never even read it. The presiding judge ruled the memoir admissible, pointing to Davis's own public statements calling it the real truth, and prosecutors are expected to play that recorded call for the jury. Suge Knight, for his part, hasn't been shy about predicting how that defense will play out. From behind bars, he's compared Davis to someone falling off a cliff and grabbing at twigs and flowers on the way down, fully aware that none of it will hold his weight. It's a strange thing to hear from the one man who could actually testify to what happened and won't, a man who seems almost amused that the person on trial talked himself into a cell simply by never being able to keep quiet, in sharp contrast to Knight's own 3 decades of silence. But the most explosive thread in this whole case doesn't involve Davis or Anderson at all. In a 2008 proffer with federal investigators, Davis reportedly named Sean Diddy Combs as the person who financed the killing, alleging that Combs had offered a bounty for Shakur and Knight both, and that he'd said as much in front of dozens of people. That claim has surfaced repeatedly in later reporting, including documents connected to a federal investigation, and it's a name that has appeared dozens of times across prosecutors' court filings. Combs has consistently and firmly denied any involvement, and Las Vegas police have stated publicly that he has never been treated as a suspect or charged in the case. That hasn't stopped the allegation from resurfacing again and again, especially from Knight, who has pointed to Combs by name in multiple interviews over the years and suggested that people in the music industry have long known more than they've said. Other figures connected to Death Row and to Combs' own inner circle have made similar allegations publicly, including claims that a large sum of money changed hands around the time of the murder and was later mishandled by an associate. None of it has resulted in charges against Combs, but it has kept his name hovering over every phase of this trial. What makes Knight's position so complicated is that it isn't really about protecting Davis or protecting anyone accused in this case. It's a code that predates the murder itself, one rooted in the neighborhoods where Knight grew up, where cooperating with law enforcement is treated as the deepest possible betrayal, deeper even than the crime being investigated. Knight has said, in his own words, that his loyalty to Shakur can't be compromised, that he isn't there to help anyone build a case and isn't there to hurt anyone either. It's a genuinely strange position to hold, a man who says he thinks about his friend every day, who watched him bleed out beside him, and who still won't do the one thing that might deliver some form of accountability for that death, because in his mind, doing so would make him something worse than the person who pulled the trigger. About Davis specifically, Knight's view seems to be that the man has effectively convicted himself through decades of public talking, and that the court should be allowed to use his own words against him rather than anything Knight might say. That leaves prosecutors in an unusual spot heading into this trial. There's no weapon, no recovered vehicle, and no cooperating eyewitness willing to name a shooter. Their case leans almost entirely on a defendant who spent 20 years describing his own involvement across books, interviews, and television appearances, and who is now trying to convince a jury that all of it was invention. It's a strange kind of prosecution, built less on evidence gathered by investigators and more on the words of the man sitting at the defense table. Toward the end of his interview, Knight shifted away from the case entirely and talked instead about his teenage son, who plays basketball, writes music, and counts Shakur among his favorite artists, the same way his own friends do. It's a small detail, but it says something about how far Shakur's influence has traveled past the people who actually knew him. A whole generation that never met him still carries his music the way Knight carries the memory of that night on the Strip. Whatever verdict eventually comes out of that Las Vegas courtroom, it seems unlikely to settle every question this case has raised over the past 30 years. Some of those questions may simply belong to Suge Knight alone, and has made it clear he intends to keep them there. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.